Order, order. We now come to our public proceedings of the Education Select Committee this morning. This morning we are undertaking our pre-appointment hearing for Professor Edward Peck, who is the Government's nominated appointee for Chair of the Office for Students. Welcome, Professor Peck.
Thank you.
I'm going to begin our questioning this morning. Please, could you tell the committee what led you to apply for this role and what relevant experience you'll bring to it?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation this morning. I see this has been an important part of the appointments process for this role. I'm looking forward to exploring the issues you want to raise about the OFS and the higher education system. So, my motivation. I've been a public service leader in the NHS higher education for the best part of 40 years. And during that time, I've developed a strong commitment to, wherever possible, the providers of public services should put the interests of service users, whether they're patients or students, above the interests of the institution that they work for. This is particularly the case when you're dealing with people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, in my case mental health patients in the NHS, and of course at my university a large portion of students who come from the lowest income households. Now, I think most public sector leaders try to do that, many do it successfully, but I think there's sometimes a challenge in doing it consistently and to the highest standard, and I think that contributes to the variation in performance you see both between organisations and within organisations. Now, most sectors that have significant public funding, either directly or indirectly, have some regime which looks at ensuring standards and improving quality. I'm familiar with the one from the NHS, mostly. But when I came to higher education leadership, I saw there was no such approach. So right from the outset in 2017, I think I was the first Vice-Chancellor to advocate for a regulator in higher education. I did so publicly. Since then, I've supported the OFS in its activities, and I have taken the view that it would have been surprising if, in the introduction of a new regulatory regime, it was perfectly designed in its first iteration. I think we've learned a lot about the OFS in its first 8 years, and I think the BN Review has articulated very well what some of those challenges have been and the way forward. And having been an advocate for this activity, and having such a strong commitment to, this case, a student interest, it seemed to me I should step forward and seek a leadership role for the OFS to take it into its next phase and deliver on that student interest as well as we can. In terms of my experience, I've been the Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham-Trent University for over a decade. Within that time, I think we have become renowned for the quality of our student experience and the student outcomes we deliver. We've received the TEF Gold rating on both occasions it's been awarded, and we have been financially robust throughout that period, including the last couple of years when the finances have become a little more challenging. As a result of the success of my university, I was approached 3 years ago to become the DFE's Higher Education Student Support Champion, a role explicitly designed to promote good practice in student support across higher education. And within that, and subsequently, I am chair of the Mental Health Task Force, which has been promoting ways of improving mental health support for students across English higher education, and which came initially with the potential for a regulatory intervention if certain standards weren't met. And I can talk more about that if that would be of interest. I have a very thorough knowledge of the sector. I have been a board member of UUK, I've been on the Employers Association, and I'm currently the chair of UCAS. And finally, I've been a non-exec director or trustee on over 10 organisations across 3 regulatory regimes in the last 15 years. So I think I'm well prepared to take on this role.
Thank you very much. What aspects of the role do you expect to be the most challenging?
The most challenging, I think, for me, particularly initially, is to understand the legal framework within which the OFS has been operating, its implications, and the judgments it's made about the way it uses its powers in relation to the sector. I think that's what I'm least cited on, and I'd want a priority briefing on that for the Chief Executive and the legal advice to the OFS to fully understand the way in which so far it has pursued its regulatory in particular role and how that might be developed over the course of the next 5 years.
Thank you. If your appointment is confirmed, you'll be responsible for formulating and ensuring the successful delivery of the OFS strategy. How are you planning to address the recommendations of the Lords Committee and also the subsequent Bean report in your delivery of the strategy?
Yes, thank you. That's an important question. The House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee, I think, made some very important points, particularly about regulatory burden, which I think the OFS have to take very seriously. And I would be looking, were to be appointed, to explore the extent to which the OFS has really been rigorous in taking the leanest approach it can to the way in which it approaches regulation. And also, has it followed the key principle of the regulator's code, which is to be risk-based? I also want to explore the extent to which there are activities which are currently either in train or being planned, which may not be the top priority at the moment, given all the things that the OFS has to do. And I'll take a very clear-eyed view of what those things might be. In terms of the Bean report, I very much support its recommendations. They've been well received in government, I believe, and certainly by the sector. We need to develop those in the context of the new higher education policy the government is going to articulate shortly. I'm interested also in how we get governing bodies and other forms of non-executive leadership of higher education more involved in the regulatory process. I'm very committed to getting the right balance between quality improvement and standards regulation. So there's a broad range of areas I'd want to put into the next strategy for the OFS, which I see as being the key document, actually, for developing and articulating what it is the OFS is going to do. And I want to do that in fairly short order, particularly when I was clear about where the government wants to take higher education policy next, and what is the role of the Office for Students in delivering that policy.
Thank you. And just before we go any further, I wondered whether there were any disclosures you wanted to make to the committee about political activity previously.
Yes, I was a member of the Labour Party in 2019 and 2020 for 12 months. I was not politically active, and I have not been a member since.
Thank you. It's helpful to have that in the public domain. I will go to Manuela. No, not to Manuela, to Mark.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. So you've touched on the reports that the Chair's already outlined. What steps, if you're appointed, will you take to drive organisational change?
Right. So I think one of the key things any incoming chair will do is look at the capacity and capability of the board and the senior executive team, and the extent to which we have the skills and the experience across the board to deliver the priorities that have been agreed with government over the course of the next 5 years. Secondly, I would want to look at the priorities that have been set and the extent to which we can deliver those within a business plan for next year in a context where finances are liable to be constrained. So I think we have to be really practical about what we do in the next 12 months. However, I'd want the strategy to articulate a compelling vision both for the external stakeholders but also for people inside the OFS. So absolutely clear what it is we're going to do, why we're doing it, and why it really matters to students and to the sector and to government. Because it seems to be a key role of the strategy is to mobilise the commitment of people who work in an organisation to do their best to deliver it. Now, I think at the outset we need to look forward 5 years and see where we're trying to get to in 5 years' time. We can't go there in one step, it'll be several, but we have to be clear about the end point before we start. So that everything we do over those 5 years builds towards that model of regulation that we think is best suited to higher education.
Okay. And are there any immediate first steps that you'll take? You've set out a clear long-term vision there over 5 years. Are there any immediate first steps you'll take should you be appointed?
Yes, I want to explore the way in which we can move towards two issues, and I've raised both of them already. The first is how we get more of an emphasis on quality improvement, what I might call promoting the good to balance controlling the bad. And I think there's a lot of benefit to be gained by doing more work on promoting good practice through the OFS. And the second is to engage much more with the governing bodies of institutions. They are, of course, the ultimate decision makers for universities, corporations for colleges, and, of course, there's private sector boards for private sector providers. I'm not sure the extent to which we have now really engaged them in the regulatory activity and the expectation of regulation which can be discharged by those bodies. So I think they're two really important priorities. The most immediate challenge, though, I think we get a business plan for next year, which we can deliver the priorities of the government, which are around regulating and registering more providers, picking up the codes of conduct around freedom of speech and sexual harassment. There's a lot to do, so we need a very clear business plan to get us through the next 12 months if I was appointed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. And I need to declare that I worked as a university lecturer for the past 20 years. Not anymore. So, thank you, Professor Peck. So, higher education providers face an existential challenge on funding, and we've seen some of the impact through a large volume of redundancies announced by several universities. What will the Office for Students need to do to support both the sector and students through this challenge?
That's a really, really good question. Can I take a little time to explore it, Chair? I think it's pretty crucial. Well, first of all, the financial independence of higher education providers is a really important feature of the system. And I think much of the success of the sector and its respect worldwide has derived from its independence from local or national government oversight, which I think has been largely the case in other countries. So I think we have to take that autonomy seriously, both in good times and more challenging times. I would seek a very urgent briefing with the Chief Exec of the UFS to understand what we've learned about the financial position of the institutions where we are currently, as I understand through the UFS, putting in consultancy support to get a really good assessment of how they're performing financially, those that are most financially precarious. And I'd want to know the extent to which those universities have done all the things you do as an organisation when you face financial pressures. There are 5 or 6 things that routinely you do. To what extent have they been done by those organisations? So to what extent is the financial pressure they're facing particularly acute because they haven't yet got through all the cost reduction measures that would have actually enabled to balance income with expenditure? And that's the first thing. Now, I think a lot of institutions are still on that journey, and they will get to a point where they can balance income and expenditure. However, there may be institutions where the market's changed so much and their business model doesn't let them do that, that there may be a requirement for further intervention. That probably wouldn't be for the OFS, although I think we could advise on the sorts of activities around reconfiguration or different forms of relationship between universities that might be beneficial. That's a government decision about whether or not to support reconfiguration of those universities, particularly financially. Although my question would be, if it's a good plan to reconfigure and maybe merge institutions, why won't their own banks lend to them if it's such a good plan? Why does the government have to do it? I think if an institution, though, genuinely now has a non-viable position and is not prepared to take that kind of action, I'm not sure the government should step in with what's been called the weekend a bailout. There's an issue about that in terms of moral hazard, it seems to me. There may be questions about the leading further to a conversation about universities and colleges and other providers between public sector organisations, which I think we want to avoid. And practically, where's the cash coming from? So I think there's a lot to think about here. But it seems to me most institutions should be able to get in a position where they balance their income and expenditure. And autonomy means doing exactly that. The OFS's role here is to give advice and to monitor and to advise government on what's going on. It's to make sure that any actions taken, either in the short term or medium term, around reconfiguration, do not reduce the benchmark delivery of providers. And ultimately, if a provider is going to fail, to step in and make sure the students are protected through implementation of the Student Protection Plan. So the role of the OFS here is very clearly defined, although I think the context the OFS needs both to understand and to some extent shape, so we get the best way forward in these circumstances.
Okay, thank you. You have described an impressive turnaround of the finances of Nottingham Trent University under your Vice Chancellorship. So what lessons can you derive from your experience for the sector's finances? That's my first question. And then how can providers diversify away from over-reliance on international student fees?
Thank you. Well, the experience we've had at Nottingham Trent University has been to be absolutely clear with all of our colleagues, including the trade unions, about the nature of the situation we face and the choices we have to take. So we have a monthly Q&A where we ask anything that colleagues want to ask us, and we will answer them in real time. And that's often about financial position, and particularly the pressure we faced. We had a 10% reduction in student numbers between last year and this year. That's significant. That's 4,000 students. That meant about a 10% reduction in income. We've gone for a 10% reduction broadly in our staff base. But we explained clearly why we're doing that. We did it through ways which were timely. We got there early, so we had plenty of time to plan and think and design what we did. And it's all been done through voluntary means, largely actually through deleting vacancies. You start thinking about your capital programme, how you reduce it. You think about non-staff expenditure. You talk to your banks about how you can reschedule against a plan that gets you to a viable position over a period of time. So there's lots of ways of doing this that I think universities are becoming very familiar with. So I think that's the first part of the question. Sorry, the second part?
Was about how can providers diversify away from over-reliance on international student fees?
Yes, I think this is a really difficult one, actually, because there are certain institutions that can probably assume that, notwithstanding the current decline in international students overall, they're probably still going to recruit a fair number of them, and therefore they can probably forecast those in a reasonable way. I think part of the problem we've had in the past is that the OFS has received projections, it says, of student numbers that have not been realistic, particularly international student numbers from some providers. So I think that providers need to be very, very clear-eyed again, and as do their governing bodies, actually, about the realism of what is underpinning their financial projections. Those that can't assume that they can recruit international student numbers to anything like the extent they used to should be absolutely clear that they can sustain their viability based on undergraduate student numbers and other forms of income they might generate. There are some new ways coming along which I think providers are trying to use to generate more income. Franchising is an example. I think that can be a great way of putting in place provision that encourages people in HE cold spots or from more deprived backgrounds or more mature students to get into HE. But again, the National Audit Office has raised some issues around potential fraud. So I think they have to be really careful in maintaining the reputation of the sector when they diversify.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, thank you again, Chair. So thanks for your answers so far. Obviously, there's a climate of intense financial pressure in the sector. How can the sector protect the quality of courses that it offers, and what do you see as the role of the OFS in that?
Yes. Well, I would imagine that the decline in student numbers is occurring in a certain range of subjects, and it's important that institutions, they look to balance their books and think about the number of staff they need to deliver that particular range of courses, particular quality. Certainly at my university, we use as one of our benchmarks how many colleagues did we have teaching this subject. At the last time we had this many students teaching, studying, and that goes back 5 years actually. So you have to adjust the number of people you have working in the institution, the number of students you have. If you do that, you should find the quality should not be affected, because in a way you still have the same resource base to teach those students, and that's certainly the approach that we have taken. So I think that's the major thing that I would ask institutions to think about, and I'm sure most institutions are thinking about that. And the other thing that's starting to happen, I think, is that institutions are talking to each other more about those courses which maybe we are all doing, but actually can't be sustained across 3 or 4 universities, but might be sustainable across one. And I think far more conversations about collaborative provision, either teaching different parts of a course together or passing certain courses to one university so they can carry on with a viable cohort where they can't across 3 or 4. Now, we have to make sure the OFS has sensible guidance which derives from the Competition and Markets Authority to make that possible. But it seems to be a practical way forward because many universities are offering quite close geographical proximity. So I think it's those two things I'll be asking institutions to think about as the OFS chair, if I was appointed.
Can I just follow up on that in 2 respects? The first is that there are some issues with the Competition and Markets Authority at the moment that prevent exactly that kind of collaboration between universities from happening. So I wonder what your approach would be to engagement with them on that set of issues. And secondly, I mean, we are seeing a great deal of alarm being raised from many people within the university sector at the moment, and a further announcement of 5,000 more redundancies today. And the measures that you describe are sensible business planning measures for a large organisation in a normal environment. Are you concerned that the university sector is no longer in a normal environment, and that there is a risk of something more significant in terms of a range of institutions toppling over the edge of financial viability with much more widespread implications in the current scenario?
Yes, I find it hard to answer that question without fully understanding the briefing I want to receive from the Chief Exec about where we are. If you look at the projections the OFS put out last November about what would happen on current trajectories of financial plans submitted, they didn't include all the mitigations that I know higher education providers are putting in place to reduce the amount that they may lose in year and in future years. So it's very hard to judge, I think, the nature of the potential crisis, and I'm very clear about that picture. So I wouldn't want to say too much more about that at this stage. I think it would be premature. But you can rest assured that once I'd seen the position, I'd be making it clear to the government what the nature of the challenge was facing, and how many of those providers face the existential sort of crisis you mentioned earlier, Morelli. I think that's an important question. I just don't think at the moment I know sufficient about where we are to be able to answer that question authoritatively.
Just on the Competition and Markets Authority.
Yes, I think that the position I would take in the conversation with them if I was chair is to say the approach here is to maintain choice within a geographical area. And what we don't want is 3 or 4 institutions, all of which are struggling to carry on teaching, say, modern languages, which is a subject often which comes under pressure due to small numbers of applications. We don't all fall to withdraw. We want to maintain the choice of doing modern foreign languages in that locality. Mm-hmm. And the way of doing that is to collaborate, or to make sure one is specialising in it, if others, different institutions specialise in something else. And that's the sort of conversation I think the CMA will be open to. It's about protecting choice.
Yeah, thank you. Amanda.
I'm going to ask a few questions around relationship with providers, the workforce and students. So the OFS has been criticised in recent years for being an instrument of government policy agenda. How in practice will you achieve and demonstrate the independence of the OFS from government ministers?
Yes, thank you. This is something the BN report looked at in some detail, and I think, and he came to the conclusion that that criticism probably was not entirely justified in the evidence that he'd seen, i.e. that the OFS was more independent of government than perhaps some providers were suggesting. Having said that, I want to be absolutely crystal clear that as chair I would want to work with the government on setting a clear context and policy framework for the OFS, and making sure that we understood some of the challenges that we've faced in delivering that and keeping a clear line of communication open. But when it comes to operational decision-making, the OFS is an independent organisation. And it's really important it is, and I protect that independence and certainly patrol that independence.
You told us around your extensive experience in the sector, which brings, a lot of value to it. But how would you use your expertise to establish effective relationships with a wide range of senior HE stakeholders, but also including some former colleagues that you would have worked with, while preserving the independence of the OFS? I'm
really glad you asked that question. I'm sure it's on lots of people's minds, and I welcome the chance to deal with it. One of the things I do bring is a wide range of networks across the sector. I have had lots of emails saying to me that people welcome my potential appointment because they want to build a better relationship between the sector and the OFS. I think that's a really important starting point, and I certainly work very hard to do that. However, I go back to my point about the student interest being what absolutely must drive the OFS. I come to education from another sector, which I think brings together objectivity. And of course, I've done lots of consultancy in my career about organisations and how they can improve and where they might need to develop. The evidence I point to for my independence is my contribution to the Orgo review, the Fees and Funding Review 2018-2019, which came out with a series of recommendations which were clearly in the student interest. The one that attracted the most attention was the reduction in the headline fee from 9,250 to 7,500, but there were others. One was around integrated foundation years, and how their growth was not in the interest of students, because there were other ways in which students could access that kind of course without paying a full fee for undergraduate provision. And the fee regime for classroom-based integration foundation years is going down next year by £4,000, and that's part of the consequence of both the OGO review. I think me keeping on championing that policy over the last 4 or 5 years, in truth. So I think that shows my independence. I will put the interests of students above the interests of institutions, which is the right thing to do.
Thank you, and that leads me on to another question, which is around students. How do you suggest the OFS improves its relationship with students?
This is a challenging one for the OFS because there's such a diverse range of students, there's such a diverse range of institutions. And I think it's made a good start in doing that. I think the student panels, they've revamped them recently. They've used a lot more student media these days, social media, to try and engage with students in ways that students are used to be engaged with. They're running surveys, currently the one on sexual harassment. I think will be very revealing about the experience of students around that particular topic. And of course they have the National Student Survey. The one I'd add is the relationship with the National Union of Students and students' unions. I think the view of government now is the NUS has sorted out its issues around anti-Semitism. It's under new management. It is now an organisation which I think can be dealt with and consulted by government. And I think their view represents a very broad and deep range of student opinion that I think we need to take on board the OFS. So there's a range of ways of doing it, and I think we have to triangulate or coordinate those various perspectives to make sure we reflect all the views of students and their different needs at higher education.
Thank you. And finally for me, how will you mitigate the unpopularity of the rise in the OFS registration fee for providers?
Well, I think we have to be clear what the sector gets for registration and the benefit of having an ability to say to the public, the press, politicians, the providers of higher education who are receiving government money absolutely meet certain standards. I think the sector has to recognise that fundamentally in their interest that happens. Clearly I want to make sure it was reasonable in the current circumstances, and there may be some ways, and it goes back to the legal framework point I made at the start, maybe ways in which the OFS could deliver some of its registration and other activities in a leaner way. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that some things are a cost burden to the providers. It's probably also a cost burden to the OFS. So there's a mutual interest in making these processes efficient and lean for both parties.
Thank you. Darren.
Thank you, Chair. And I also am proud to point back to a 20-year career in higher education and previous member of UCU. Carrying on in the same vein, this Education Committee in its previous iteration heard evidence before that suggested the OFS did not have, and I quote, particular presence or standing in the minds of students. So before I ask you about how you're going to tackle that, what in applying for this job convinces you that the OFS is fit for purpose?
Oh, well, I think it has achieved some successes in the course of the last 8 years. It has registered all those providers who up until a certain recent date had applied. It has done a very effective work around the teaching excellence framework, which is well respected in the sector. The access participation plans, I think, are making a difference to the ways in which universities and colleges and other providers address the way in which they enable students from disadvantaged backgrounds both to enter and to thrive in higher education. So I don't think it's entirely a picture of not achieving some of the key things the sector needs it to achieve. I think the question becomes one of the relationships where the OFS perhaps has misunderstood independence as meaning distance. And I think that's something the House of Lords report also reflected upon. There's no need to be that distant. As long as you're independent, you can collaborate, you can build a common consensus about what's the best way to do, but you still retain your independence. I think there's also a question about the extent to which, and it goes back to the Beans Review's conclusion about an integrated quality system, how far the teaching excellence framework and some of the inspection-based activity constitutes a coherent and coordinated approach to quality, both inspection and quality assurance. And I'd be very keen to make sure we get that right. When you start to build those things into the picture, I think you can build a regulator that has real impact and will be respected, and in fact an asset to the sector. It needs a body that can say authoritatively to press, politicians, public, the sector is doing these things to a standard which we can be confident in.
But you'll understand, obviously, the challenge when an office for students is not seen to have the kind of confidence of or that engagement with students. So I'd be interested to know from the picture that you've just painted how you would intend to use your experience to build back that credibility, both with providers and with the students themselves. And that credibility, as you, I think, have rightly said, depends on its perception as an independent body. So how would you go about achieving that?
Well, I hope I've dealt with a bit about the providers, because I do think there are steps that we can build upon what's been respected by providers, but also recognise there'll always be an issue, and there should be an issue of gritting the oyster, shouldn't there, between a regulator and providers. And we're not going to get away from that, and I don't think it would be beneficial if necessarily we always did. On the students, I'm not sure that the view is that they haven't worked really hard to get the student view. I think they have rethought their student panels. I think they are using social media. They are using surveys. If there are other ways that providers would like to enable the OFS to access their students and get a better student view, I think I'd be really open to hearing that as the chair of the OFS. And I am, I think, committed to working with the NUS. I've been doing that, actually, mental health task force and student sport champion. And they've been very responsive and very constructive and very open to having detailed conversations about the interests of students as they see them, based on the network of student unions which make up their membership. It just needs hard and determined work because, of course, the student group also turns over every 3 to 4 years. You have to keep on bringing through students who are able and confident to articulate their views and the views of their peers. It's not an easy thing to do, particularly given the range of students in higher education. But I'm determined we have to make it as effective as we can. And certainly when I've been working Student Sport Champion, the mental health task force, we have got agendas which have been shaped by students, and we've been delivering those with a collaborative, multi-agency approach.
You'll be aware that the Bean report made recommendations around strengthening the voice of students, particularly in the OFS's governance. So touched on it a bit. Could you say a bit more about what you think the concrete deliverables are that you would seek to achieve within the first couple of years?
So we face a similar issue at UCAS, actually, about how do you get the student voice, indeed the applicant voice and the student voice, represented in UCAS. And you need to make a connection, I think, between a group of students who are well supported, well briefed, understand the role they have, and their ability to feed in directly to the governance arrangements of the UCAS in my current discussions, but in future of the OFS. I've also learned that you both need to ask students broad views about a range of issues, but actually often it's best to ask them a specific question. What is your view of this? What could make this particular aspect of vision more effective? Ask them very focused questions and make sure you take those responses absolutely into the government arrangements of the OFS, and that's what I would commit to doing. I would want to meet with the students panel myself regularly. I'd want to go out and meet students' unions on my visits to institutions. I want to engage with the NUS and actually ask their view about how we could do this better. What do students believe is the best way of getting this, the organisation to really respond to their concerns? I think you're right to challenge this. I think it's a difficult thing to get right, but I'm very committed to making sure that we do. And I can point to where in my previous career I have very much wanted to engage and have shaped what I have done on the views of students, or early in my career, other forms of service users in the NHS. So I have a long track record of doing this.
I've got time for one quick supplementary. I appreciate what you've been saying and setting out in terms of re-engaging with students, but in terms of providers, there are still concerns about the regulatory burden on providers, and certainly some plans that currently the OFS is going to not remove any of its current regulation, but actually be adding to that. So what are your thoughts on dealing with that? Because a lot of what happens next will affect the credibility of OFS in the eyes of providers.
Yes. So I think it's a really important theme for providers. And as I noted, if something's a burden to providers, it's probably a burden to the OFS as well. So there's a mutual interest in getting this right. I do want to look again at how risk-based the OFS is in every intervention it designs. I do think there may be ways of doing things more leanly, which is why I want to explore the legal framework, as I noted. And there may be some things that at the moment just aren't a priority. The one that's been raised with me by the sector is the interest in more regulatory activity around transnational education. I'd want to explore with the OFS why that was thought to be a priority at this moment, given everything else that's going on. So I do have some ideas also about areas to explore the OFS about, do they need to be done now, important as they may be.
Thank you. Patrick.
Thank you, Professor Peck, for coming here and putting yourself forward for the role. My question is going to be about freedom of speech on campuses. The Office for Students has always had the power to intervene on free speech on campuses, but hasn't always used that. I just wanted to ask you how important you feel the OFS's role in defending freedom of speech on campuses, and certainly give us an idea of where in your own personal hierarchy of importance does that responsibility sit?
Thank you. Well, I think it's absolutely crucial. Universities should, and colleges and other providers, they should be places where ideas can be explored, examined, challenged, where disagreement can be facilitated, where new viewpoints can be discovered. It's crucial. Without that, I don't think we have a university sector which would be the envy of the world as it is now. So that's my starting point. It's a contested area. It's one that's difficult sometimes to get right. But I think where the government has landed in terms of the freedom of speech legislation, as it's proposed to be amended, gets the balance right between the need to ensure freedom of speech, but also, I think, to make sure that we are dealing with speech which is unacceptable, goes beyond the law, or indeed is discriminatory or in other ways causes harassment. And that's the thing we're trying to achieve. So the OFS has a duty now to say to providers, produce a code of practice. I think it's going to be implemented for the summer, where providers are obliged to secure and promote free speech. I think that's really important, and there's some guidance on what that code of practice requires institutions to do. Beyond that, students have the right to take a complaint to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, and staff and visiting speakers will have the right to bring a complaint to the OFS if the legislation passes in the way it's been proposed. And the next key role of the OFS is to design that complaints process and to set clear criteria for the sorts of complaints it is going to consider as being significant that warrant an investigation. Now, once the OFS has done that, as chair, I'd want to make sure we take robust regulatory action if we find that the code of practice of institutions has not been followed and that complaints from staff or visiting speakers are justified.
Can I have one more follow-up? And please understand this question comes from experience on campuses in America. What would you say, and what would the OFS do if you woke up one morning and it transpired that there was a protest on a campus at a university in the UK in which students had said from the river to the sea and called for an intifada?
I'd expect that university taking robust action to investigate those accusations, and if they were found to be upheld, to take action in line with their own disciplinary processes.
Down on that university if it didn't pursue it as you saw the legislation sees fit?
Yes, I think we'd want to see the code of practice have been observed and implemented. And if there was a complaint that came forward from a member of staff or from a visiting speaker where the OFS was enabled to do an investigation, that is what we would do if it was serious enough to warrant meeting the criteria we'd set. So, I mean, I'm very committed to this. It's very important that every student feels safe and secure and respected as they study on campus. And some of the activities over the last 18 months have not always, I think, made particularly Jewish students feel that. It's really important that universities work with the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's really important they include some of the University of Jewish Students' materials in their induction for students so people understand what anti-Semitism is, how to recognise it, and how sometimes to recognise it in yourself as well as in others. These are all really important steps, I think, that create the atmosphere on campus where I hope, in the instance you've seen in the US, would not take place in the UK. But if students are using language which is discriminatory, which can be seen as harassing people, or indeed in some cases is beyond what the law allows, then of course universities must deal with that in their own disciplinary procedures.
Thank you. Serena.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to now consider widening access and participation in higher education. We can see that your achievements at Nottingham Trent University for students from disadvantaged backgrounds culminated in a social mobility prize. So can you draw on your experiences to help pivot other HE providers, particularly those that are highly selective, to better inform access and participation for disadvantaged and underrepresented groups?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the recognition of the work we've been doing at the university. I think that the way in which we've approached this is to be very open in the way that we've made offers to applicants. And in particular, we've made very extensive use of contextual offers, where we look at the social circumstances of applicants, be they care leavers, from lower-income backgrounds, from certain groups with protected characteristics, and made sure that we, first of all, made those students offers that reflected their potential as well as their attainment, given some of the challenges they might have faced in their lives that day. And that's a really key part of this. That goes alongside a very active outreach work into our local communities and schools, and beyond that, to make applicants from those backgrounds understand that that is what we will do if you apply. We'll make you an offer which we hope meets your reasonable attainment given your background, but also that we have significant amounts of support for you when you arrive. So we put a lot of thought into induction, into transition, into welcome. We put a lot of thought into student support. I guess that's why I became student support champion. Nottingham Trent, particularly my colleagues, are very good at this. They have taken personalisation of support to a very, very developed level. So every student, despite being a big university, should have the opportunity to get the support they need to meet their particular challenges. But the other thing we've done, and this is a more structural approach, is we have opened a campus in Mansfield, which we did that because it's one of the places that has the lowest level of sociability of any town in the UK, and it's 15 miles up the road from Nottingham. And while we didn't feel responsible for it, we felt we had an opportunity, I think, to shift that. Over the course of the last 5 years, we've seen significant numbers of local people and mature students studying for level 4, level 5 and full degree qualifications at Mansfield, then going into work in engineering, computing, nursing. So we've changed the way in which we make the offer accessible to people from those backgrounds. I think that's absolutely crucial if we're going to move the dial in the future. The next two steps we want to take at NTU, and these are the things I want to for the OFS, is first of all to make sure that how we regulate modular provision at the of OFS enables providers to put in place modular, flexible, agile courses which are going to fit around the work lives and caring lives of people who currently are not going to university, whether they're 18 or whether they're 35. I think that's really important. And the other thing I want to explore is the gap between the people who register every year with UCAS. There are 1.2 million people every year express an interest in going to higher education in the UK, but only 600,000 actually accept a place. What happens to the other 600,000? And if we get more details of them and what stopped them applying, or indeed stop them getting a place, I think we get much more progress in targeting modular provision of vocational skills-based courses which meet local employers' needs into those communities where traditionally people have thought university is not for them. So it's not just about getting more people to come and do traditional degrees, it's about changing what it means and where it means to do higher education. And I think if we do that, we really start to turn the dial on getting more people from a diverse range of backgrounds into higher education.
Okay, thank you.
I believe passionate about this, as you may have just picked up. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline.
Chair, excuse me for arriving late. I'd like to ask you how the board will drive the OFS to ensure that students are getting the best value of money from higher education providers, particularly as it obviously is becoming more and more expensive to complete higher education.
Yes. So it's one of the key objectives of the Office for Students is to ensure value for money, and I think that should remain. The autonomy of providers means that they can run the courses they want to run with the curriculum they want to provide, and the choice students can make is to go and study those courses. And I think we should keep that. It's an important part of our system. And most providers provide a high quality level of input to their students and support over the 3 or 4 years that students may be with them. But because they are being funded with a significant amount of public money, both directly and indirectly, I think it's entirely right the OFS has the ability to set some absolute benchmarks for levels of provision below which providers must not fall. And they are based on metrics to do with issues to do with continuation, completion, those sorts of issues. Sometimes you might want to look at other factors. So I think that's absolutely crucial. And the way in which those benchmarks are set, the level at which they're set, and what happens when they are breached, I think is something I want to explore the OFS and indeed with wider stakeholders. Are we doing enough at the moment in terms of the power of the OFS to really call to account low quality provision? The other things it can do is make sure its codes of practice are being observed, so that particularly on student support, things like the Code of Practice on Sexual Harassment, we're making sure that students are also not just getting the academic input they deserve, but getting an environment in which they feel supported, respected and safe. And I think that's really important, because that's one of the things you're paying for as well if you go to university or college. And the other factor is the quality improvement part, this thing about promoting the good I was talking about earlier. I think we do much more through the OFS to really promote good practice across our campuses. And I think institutions, by and large, want to do the right thing, but not always they know how or recognise what best practice is. It means looking at things like the what works evidence that is being produced in the sector. There's a whole range of things I think that the OFS can do in quality improvement activity to really encourage and support better value for money for students, but holding on to that code of practice and those baseline standards.
Can I ask do you think that the benchmarking, the level of provision being provided to students, would that include in-person tuition? Because we know that in many places that's dropped off quite considerably since COVID, and yet people are still paying full whack for the course, whereas they may not actually be sitting in front of...
Yes, it's a good question. It's a real concern, I know, of many students and many parents when they talk about contact hours. Of course, the way in which colleges, universities, private providers deliver their curriculum is part of their autonomy. Our task is to make sure that the standards are met, that the codes of practice are being observed, and the quality improvement is being engaged with. I may have views personally about contact hours, but they're not really directly relevant to my mandate as chair of the OFS.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you very much. We know that university students are more at risk of experiencing depression and anxiety than their working peers, and up to 2/3 of female students have experienced sexual harassment at university. How will you deploy OFS tools to create momentum around improving the wider student experience, including on issues such as mental health and sexual harassment?
Thank you. I've been doing a lot of work as chair of the Mental Health Task Force for the last couple of years, and the agenda we were set largely derived from the views of students, but also from bereaved parents who had some real concerns about the experiences that their family members had had while at university. And these related to a range of issues the task force has been taking forward. So it's how good are universities at recognising the mental health of students who don't declare a vulnerability, disability or illness. So how can you get much better at doing that? And there's 3 or 4 things we're doing now with the sector to make them better at recognising students who may be exhibiting distress. We've worked a lot on information sharing. There was a real concern from bereaved parents that some parts of the sector, some part of the university, were not sharing information with other parts of the university or with accommodation providers or students' unions. We're dealing with that. And also that communications were often insensitive, that they were just not thinking about students who might be vulnerable in the way in which they wrote to them. And universities have really got behind sorting that out and reviewing all their policies and their communications. That's really making progress. We've also commissioned a national review of local suicide investigations for last academic year. That's been a very thorough piece of work. A large number of universities have submitted a large number of reports. That will be a major contribution, I think, to understanding where we are. That will be published about a month's time, I understand. And then we're doing some work on guidance to help the NHS and higher education providers create a better relationship, a more structured relationship, so that students who have serious mental illness get the support they need quickly and effectively. Now, the challenge of bereaved parents has been about, you say these things are happening, how can you show me? So there are three things we're working on. The first is the University Mental Health Charter, and we've got the vast majority of universities now signed up, UK member universities. About 92% of English students are now covered by institutions in the Mental Health Charter, and that means they will be assessed their mental health provision over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. The second is we are working with a committee of university chairs to see how a focus on mental health can be much better woven into the governance arrangements that they are going to put in place to oversee the quality and effectiveness of their mental health provision. I think that's a really important piece of work from the CUC, and other mission groups or other parts of the sector are also working on that to reflect their particular governance arrangements. It goes back to my earlier point about making governance much more central, I think, to ensuring of standards in our universities. And finally, the bereaved parents have said, why can't we put more of an emphasis on mental health into the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, next time it's run? I think that's a really interesting suggestion that, as chair, I'd want to explore the OFS. On sexual harassment, I am absolutely committed to the steps that are going to be taken in terms of the code of practice. I think it's overdue. It's certainly my university. We've been very clear about the unacceptability of sexual harassment. We've run consent training for many years. We have a clear policy that we do not accept relationships between staff and students because we don't think that's appropriate. So we're unequivocal about those things, and I think the code of practice will bring that same degree of rigour across all of the sector. I wouldn't say I'm looking forward to the outcomes of the sexual harassment survey the OFS is currently undertaking, because it might contain some very difficult messages. But I think we have to see what they say to us in that survey, and then look at the code of practice again and see, are we going far enough to protect students from sexual harassment?
Yes, I'd just like to ask you supplementary on that, if you don't mind. So in my previous role, I worked supporting survivors of sexual violence and rape. And students made up quite a significant proportion of the people we were supporting. And working across the survivor community, across the UK, it was really apparent that many universities were much more concerned about their reputation and their ranking than even admitting there was a problem, far less trying to eradicate it or properly supporting students, using NDAs, bringing in the lawyers, the publicity people before even sort of taking the mental health support seriously. So what do you think the Office for Students can do to make sure that student victims of sexual violence on campus are the priority rather than the reputation of the university? Because the reality is that it's happening in every single university. So for a university to try and pretend it's not happening should not be the priority. It's not the reality.
So I agree with that. It is happening in every university, as are student suicides happen in every university. They're no respect for a social gradient. And it's really important that universities are as open as they feel they can be. And one of the things that's is being talked about around, I think, public services more broadly, but particularly, I think, around universities, is what would it look like to have a duty of candour in the way there is in the NHS, so that the assumption is that institutions are open about what has happened, what they've done about it, how it can be prevented in the future. And certainly, in terms of mental health, I think there'd be real benefit in doing that. I think universities struggle, and I think it's a parallel issue to sexual violence. They struggle, I think, with engaging with families about what has... This is what I hear this a lot from bereaved families. They struggle engaging with bereaved families quickly enough or openly enough. I think universities would admit that. I can see there'll be similar issues around some elements of sexual violence, and we need to make sure we get that openness and honesty across the whole range of institutions. Only if we manage to do that will we'll learn, and will people feel reassured that if it does happen, it will be sorted out in the immediate case, and that lessons will be learnt, and we'll try and prevent it in the future. So I'm very much with you on that issue about what I frame as candour.
Thank you.
Can I just come back to the issue of mental health and ask whether you think universities should be more alive to the disjointed nature of the ways in which mental health issues might present themselves. And I should put on record that I'm the parent of a first-year university student. But it strikes me that often in cases where there have been tragic suicides of students, there is evidence, when there's been an inquest, there is evidence through the inquest that concerns have been raised about that young person by their family, by their friends. They may not have come to the attention of the professionals within the university with whom that student has the most direct contact in terms of those who are teaching them. But there may have been evidence of distress through a kind of failure to attend or, those kinds of things. Do you think that universities need to strike a better balance between respecting the adulthood of the students on their campus, but recognising that those adults are at a particularly vulnerable phase in their adulthood, and making it easier for friends, family members, anyone who might have concerns about the well-being of a student can raise those concerns and have a pathway to support in a way that we recognise the ability of others to raise concerns for others in our society who have a level of vulnerability, so that fewer of those universities have to have conversations with bereaved families because they might have listened to them a bit more ahead of the issue escalating.
Yes, I do. This has been a major focus of the Mental Health Task Force. We are developing an approach around student analytics, where for many universities for many years have been looking at how well students engage with their studies and then intervening with those students who are not engaging, because we know if they don't engage they're more likely to leave. And now we're developing those to look at some of the indicators which may suggest that students are developing mental distress. And we have increasingly robust data points that we can use to do that. And there are 3 or 4 universities piloting this, one of which is my own. We're going to start doing this from next academic year. Now, of course, once you have the information, you have to know what you're going to do with it and who's going to respond. I'll come back to that in a second. The other area we'll be looking at in some depth is how we get non-specialist staff to be more confident in recognising and responding to signals of mental distress or mental illness. And we've just published a competency framework, which has been picked up by a number of stakeholder groups and indeed by institutions, to inform the training they give to those non-specialist staff to be confident in doing what they need to do. Once you've got those various sources and the other thing we've been championing, but in fact this is a UK initiative to be fair, they have put out guidance on information sharing between universities and families and other agencies. There used to be a belief that universities couldn't share information about students about which they were concerned with families. Well, it's clear from the ICO that you can. If you're generally worried about the welfare of the individual, most universities now do, and every university is now being encouraged to have a key contact which they verified when a student registers. So all that is going on. The next thing we're working on, though, is what I'm calling a case management system, because you have to bring that information together into one place so that somebody or a small group of people can see, well, picking up that from the analytics, we're getting this from the reports of their tutors or perhaps the staff in accommodation. This is starting to look like a student now who needs some more intensive support. And in that case management system, you decide, well, who's the best person to intervene? What are we going to do? How are we going to monitor it? It's work in progress, but institutions are really understanding now. And more broadly, they're understanding that student support is as important to many students as the academic input they receive. And that will require a degree of rigour and thoughtfulness about those systems, which I think universities want to provide. It's just a challenge to move from where we are to where we want to be. But a lot of universities are now very serious about that journey. And in the Mental Health Task Force, we've been giving them tools and approaches that help them move along and make their campuses safer places for their students. We're never going to prevent every student's suicide, but I think we can reduce the number, and we can make every student feel they can be as well support their mental health problems as is possible.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with the committee this morning?
I feel like quite a lot. So no, there's not. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for your time and for your very well informed and challenging questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Peck.
Thank you very much.